Morning is breaking on my street, so let's have one more cold open from my balcony as I prepare my video for the day. Over this week I have come to some conclusions about how the videos are going to work in future. It's going to be split between recipes, cooking and general cooking ideas on Tuesdays, and more general rambles on Fridays, where I'll get into religion, spirituality, philosophy, who knows, rambles in general. Anthropology will be in the mix, of course. So today I'm going to conclude my general thoughts about work, vocation, and happiness, and I will try to take my camera out in order to ramble on with some visuals that are of interest. Probably mostly pagodas, but I don't know yet. Stay tuned. Okay, so here I am at a monastery, and I hope I'm not going to be interrupted. Usually stray dogs are the big ones to interrupt me. The monks aren't going to. Anyway, I'm going to start with a little modest recap. Now remember, I talked about everyone having a vocation, and that is my statement of faith. I don't know it for absolute certain, but I believe it. And I said that a vocation was like a gift, and that we all have one, and that they're all different. Some people have big gifts, some people have small gifts. Some people, for example, have a gift to make music. Some people have the gift to organize things, something that I certainly don't. As you can see from my apartment, I'm a really untidy person. But some people really like organizing things. Some people like to write. And of course, my vocation is as a teacher. And I talked about how vocations are more like a tree, in that they have a trunk and they have roots where they come from and branches that lead from them. Okay, all so much so good. All right, now where do we go from there? Well, we can say that a vocation, in some ways, when we follow it, is like a river. That is, if we follow the vocation, it's very much like going downstream. And if we don't follow the vocation, it's very much like swimming upstream. Now, I'm going to ramble a little bit, and I'm going to explain that rambling is the way that I work when I'm teaching. I worry around a topic, and by worrying around it, I show how complicated it is, even though ultimately it's one thing. So that's the final metaphor, is that the vocation is like a multifaceted jewel. It has many facets, and in my rambling I'm going to identify all those facets. Well, the last part that I want to worry around a little more is the idea of taking your vocation once you've identified it and using it to work, to make money. And the first thing I'm quite sensitive to is the problem that not all of us can use our vocation to make money. And that means that we're always going to have jobs that are unsatisfying and maybe not be able to fulfill our vocations very often. That is, we're going to have what they sometimes call a work-life distinction or a work-life discrepancy. It's quite possible that that's true for most people. Most people have to work to make a living, and then they can practice their vocation when they're not working. And personally, I think that's a pretty awful way to live, but that is perhaps the necessity for an awful lot of people. And I accept that. But for some people, there's a choice to be made, and they have to decide, am I going to make money because I like money, and then I'm going to pursue my vocation in my spare time if I have the time? Or can you do something different? Can you say, well, I would like to pursue my vocation all the time, and even though I'm going to make very, very little money doing it, that's what I'm going to do. Now that's the dilemma I need to unpack a little. Like, how do you decide whether your vocation is worth doing all the time, even though you don't make money? I don't have a very satisfying answer to that question, but I do want to pose the question at the outset, because it concerns how I live my life. I've spent all of my life as a teacher, and I have never made the kind of money as a teacher that I could have made in other professions, but I've always chosen to be a teacher because that's my vocation. In fact, as I've gotten older, I've made less and less money. Until my last job, I made the least I've ever made in my entire life. But I was very happy doing it. It was so much that I cared about. There was a good job, good students. I was in an interesting location. I was working in Myanmar teaching science to primary school and middle school students, having a really good time, and made almost no money. That was okay, because I was happy doing it. All right, I'm going to take a little pause for a minute. I'm actually in a different tempo from the one I was recording in earlier. And I'm going to just raise one important point. That is that my blogs are not going to be in the business of giving advice. I'm not going to be saying to you, oh, you need to follow your vocation, your interest in money over vocation is wrong, all those kinds of things. I'm not going to say any of those things, because that's not my purpose, not my business. I don't know who you are. I don't know what your values are. I don't know what your training is, what your experience is. I don't know any of those things. So I'm not going to give advice. What I am going to do is I'm going to tell you what I've done and the ways in which it has benefited me, and also the ways in which those decisions have not benefited me. Now, I am in a very good position in one respect. I have a great number of qualifications for teaching in particular, and I have a great deal of experience. I've been a teacher for 42 years in universities, in secondary schools, and in primary schools. I've taught at the graduate level, and I've taught 6-year-olds. And I have 3 teaching certificates. I have a bachelor's degree, 2 MAs, and a PhD. So I have a lot going for me. And I also have a lot of financial stability at this point, so I can afford to be choosy. When I said a minute ago that my last job paid the worst, that's because I wasn't really relying on the income. Now those are my specific circumstances, and they may not be yours. But I will also say that earlier in my career, when I was a starting out lecturer, I was broke all the time. And I thought multiple times of changing to a job that paid me more money, because I was always late on bills. I was always having to refinance. I very nearly considered bankruptcy at one point. Things got so desperate. But I kept going with my vocation because it made me content in a way that just making money and working a 9-to-5 job that paid the bills and that satisfied the creditors was not really an option as far as I was concerned. It was not something that I would be happy doing. But I'm saying that I made my decisions sometimes at my own financial cost, and you may not want to do that. So I'm not going to give you advice. So ultimately, what may be an unfortunate fact is that you may want to follow your vocation, but you just simply cannot find a job that pays enough to pay the bills, to put food on the table, to keep a roof over your head, and so forth. You may have to compromise. That's just the nature of things. I'm content with that, and as I have been trying to stress, I'm not going to give you advice. I'm simply going to tell you what I've done and what people that I know have done. Now, my father changed careers completely midlife, and so did my mother. My father was an engineer in the Navy, the Royal Navy, in the Second World War, and he was demobilized in 1944 with injuries, and he went back to university and he trained first as a doctor, and then he took a degree in Spanish and Portuguese. My mother was a tailor and a dressmaker, and she, at the age of 38, I think, changed and became a teacher. So it's perfectly possible. What I don't know is whether either of them saw teaching as their vocation. There's a good reason for me to believe that my father didn't. But I don't know. And I can't ask him anymore. I can't ask my mother anymore. I'm pretty sure my mother found her vocation in teaching more than she did in dressmaking and tailoring. I think she took to teaching quite well. I think my father would have actually preferred to be a doctor. That's what his first training was when he went back to university after the war. But I don't know. So all that I can really say is that a vocation is highly personal, and that it's up to you to explore your vocation and how you can work it into your general life, whether you're going to be able to make money doing it, or whether you're going to have to leave it as a side issue, whether in fact you're perhaps not going to do anything about it at all. There's your challenge. That's something I can't give advice on. That's something you have to decide for yourself. What I can tell you with an absolute certainty is that I have followed my vocation pretty much all of my professional life, but it's been very much up and down, and I've made some very bad decisions as well as some good decisions. And that's the nature of things. And also, I've pursued my vocation, you might say relentlessly, so persistently if you like, but I've had to do a lot of other things as well. when you're a university professor, especially when you get to be older, as I am now, you end up with a lot of responsibilities as well as a lot of freedom. I could teach pretty much whenever I wanted. I could schedule my classes to suit my own whims, pretty much. But then I had a lot of committee meetings to go to. I had a lot of other responsibilities to the university as head of department. And I hated that work. I hated committee meetings, I hated paperwork, I hated administration. But it all came along with my vocation. So I'm not saying that if you follow your vocation that everything is going to be just wonderful. It's not. And it hasn't been for me. It hasn't been financially helpful. But as I've got older, not only have I had more freedom, I've also made more sensible choices in my life. And now that I'm fully retired, I have complete freedom. And that's great. But it also means that I'm not in a position to give advice to anybody about what they should be doing, given that I'm 68 years old and retired and financially secure. It would be, I think, moderately offensive to say, well, this is what you should do, because I don't know. I don't know you. I'm now in my third and final temple, and I'm going to conclude by talking a little bit more about the potential problems of having a vocation but it not being approved by society, or it not being something that's going to make a lot of money, pay the bills, and so forth, and just consider what to do in that situation. Well, there are some famous people who are in that situation. I can think, for example, of Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, who had a family history of the military, particularly the Navy, and he wasn't averse to it, but he ended up in the Navy. And he also was drawn towards literature, to writing, but his vocation as a composer won out, and he became, of course, one of the most famous composers of all time. And he was part of a group called the Five, Russian composers, also known as the Mighty Handful, and every one of them had a deep conflict between what their families wanted them to do and their vocations as musicians. I can also think of people like Charles Sanders Peirce, very famous philosopher of semiotics, who was never really able to have a job working in that field, and yet he is one of the great founders of a whole school of philosophy, as Benjamin Lee Whorf, an anthropological linguist whose theories have been tremendously influential, but who never really had much chance of success within the discipline. Vincent van Gogh, sometimes you pronounce his name incorrectly, painter, who was moved to paint extraordinary paintings and never sold any, except to his brother, who bought them out of pity as much as anything else. But he was driven by his vocation. All those people were driven by their vocations. But let's just consider something a little bit more mundane. Over the years, I have had no end of students who have had family members who have said, oh, don't go into anthropology, you'll never make any money. And they have said, well, I want to go into anthropology, it's my vocation. They probably didn't use those terms, but that was what they felt. And their parents would often come to me and they would say, well, what can my son or what can my daughter do with a degree in anthropology. And usually I would be a little craven and say, actually, I can't speak to you about your son or your daughter. It's against the law. It's very craven, very cowardly of me. But sometimes I would say to them, look, it would make them happy. Don't you want them to be happy? And they would say, no, we want them to have money. We want them to be stable and secure. And that's the inevitable tension that we're going to find, because we're not all geniuses. I'm not a genius in any sense of the word. I'm not a brilliant teacher. I'm okay. It's my vocation and I'm reasonably good at it. I'm not brilliant at it, but it makes me happy. There's the ultimate goal, is to seek happiness in our lives. And my unfounded argument is that following your vocation will lead to happiness. Now remember, I am admitting that there are two flaws in my argument. One of them is that the idea of everyone having a gift or a vocation is just a principle of faith on my part. It's not something that I can demonstrate. It's not something that has empirical evidence for it. And there's also no clear evidence that following your vocation will lead to happiness. There's a lot of clear cases where people have followed their vocation and they've been very unhappy. So I think maybe that's a good part to conclude on, but I will then predict a little bit about the future. I said that my ideas were based on faith. Well, faith has a bad reputation these days, and I think what I want to do is to talk more about faith, and in particular to make the not very extraordinary claim that much of what we do in our lives is based on faith and not on reason. Well, I hope you've enjoyed my little tours around some of the temples nearby, so that you can see a little bit more about where I live and what I'm capable of doing when I care to do it. I actually spend an awful lot of my time in my apartment, and you've seen that in another video. Well, now I'm out and about, and it's actually good for me to be out and about, because spending too much time in my apartment gets me too insular and too limited in my worldview. So this is good for me, and I hope it's all been good for you as well. So I will see you on Tuesday when we'll be doing some chameleon cooking.